Welcome back. Cosatu is demanding a representative on the SABC board. This comes as the committee sits to interview the 24 candidates shortlisted to fill vacancies on the public broadcasters board. Cosatu's Parliamentary Liaison Officer Mathew Parks joins us now from our studios in Cape Town. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for joining us. Let me just first start with your definition of what Labour representatives are.
Sure, thanks for having us. As Cosatu, we're quite disappointed that Parliament has failed to adhere to the letter and the spirit of the Broadcasting Act. The Broadcasting Act and even the advert by Parliament calling for nominations for the SABC board are quite clear. They say that the SABC board needs to include representation of Labour. It has failed to do that. There's not a single candidate in the 24 shortlisted candidates who has a Labour background, comes from the workplace, is a worker, a former shop steward, a former union official, none of that. It's quite shocking that it's been done like this. Previously, SABC boards had included worker representatives. It is the norm across many public sector boards to include Labour or union or worker representatives. And the point there is to enhance democracy, to enrich it, to make sure workers' views and voices are heard on the board and their issues are taken into account. For us, it's quite shocking that the Parliament has failed, despite us reminding them to do so, to include any Labour representatives in a shortlisting for the board.
And you're saying by so doing, they are going against or breaking the Broadcasting Act. Why?
The Broadcasting Act specifically stipulates and requires, and it says it's a must, that the SABC board includes representation of Labour. It's there in black and white, and Parliament correctly, when it advertised last year for nominations, copy and pasted that requirement exactly. It's quite shocking that the MPs weren't aware of this, didn't read it, that the parliamentary officials, when they did the shortlisting, didn't check do the candidates meet the criteria of the Act or the advert, and it's going to put them into conflict with the law. We have now written to Parliament, to the committee. We've communicated to them directly that they need to adhere to the Broadcasting Act, and we've given them 3 simple ways forward to correct the situation, to make sure they don't go down the path of illegality. First option is for them simply to include Labour representatives now in the shortlisting. We've made nominations in December. They can easily do that.
Who are those nominations, if I may ask, before you go to your second option?
Sure. From Cosatu, we nominated an official from one of our affiliates of Sakau for them to be considered by Parliament. He meets the criteria academically in terms of experience and expertise, so that's easy to do. If Parliament is not happy with his criteria or capacity, they can easily look at somebody else. That's why we've also said that if they're not happy with the nominations of Labour reps currently, they can simply leave 1 or 2 spots vacant on the board and come back to it immediately after elections. The third option, we said, if they are not able to do either of those now, is simply to delay the process now and wait until the elections and start afresh. But either way, the Broadcasting Act doesn't allow Parliament to ignore those criteria. It says it's a must. Labour must be represented on the SABC board. That has been the practice before. They don't have the option as Parliament to pass laws and then later to choose either to ignore them or to forget about them. They don't have that option as a custodian.
So you say the options available to them are to leave 2 spots open until after the elections or hold off on the selection of the board members, which is something that interest groups are saying will hurt the credibility of the SABC in covering the elections. So would you then not be creating another problem?
Look, for us, the laws are sacrosanct. They must be adhered to. Others want to go down the route of a banana republic. We've seen in the past recent 9 years what happened when government chose and even Parliament chose to ignore the laws. Is a recipe for disaster. That's why we've given 3 easy options. The most easy one for them is simply to expand the shortlisting right now and to ensure that Labour candidates are included in the shortlisting now and are included in the final recommended list for appointment to the board. That's the easiest option. They can do that immediately and still fill the board before Parliament rises in 3 weeks' time. If they can't do that for whatever reason, they can leave 1 or 2 vacancies for the time being. That won't affect the quorum. It won't affect the filling of the board. They can then ask the next Parliament to come and fill those Labour vacancies afterwards. Those are the 2 easiest options.
I've seen on statements that you are threatening to go to court if things don't go your way. Is that accurate?
Yes, and we will do that because we must defend the rule of law. The Broadcasting Act didn't fall out of the sky. It was adopted by this very Parliament. And the spirit of that act was to make sure that workers have a voice on the SABC board. And you can see with the recent developments in the past few years how critical that is. You know very well that 900 permanent staff members at SABC have been threatened with retrenchments. 2,200 contract workers at SABC have been threatened with the cancellation of their contracts. Our workers are tired of being traumatized by mismanagement by boards and executives, by having their very livelihoods being threatened. They want to have a voice at the table, and it's important for workers at SABC to have a voice at that table that must be heard, and Parliament cannot choose to ignore the Act.
So that is your primary concern on these candidates that you want on the board, to be focused on that, workers' issues, on labour issues, which you say have been quite a stickler for the SABC and its board.
Yes, and that's our job as a trade union, to make sure that our workers, our members' voices are heard. Our affiliate, the Communication Workers Union, has been adamant about this. And across SABC, from the TV to radio stations at large, workers are very frustrated that their views, their voices, their needs have been ignored for too long. They've been treated like playthings. Is it unimaginable that the Presidential Jobs Summit in October last year, where the President committed to no retrenchments in the public sector, we then saw a month later the SABC board threatening to retrench over 3,000 workers. So it's critical that workers' views are heard, and workers are well placed to enrich the discussions of boards. They can help point out to where corruption is taking place, where there's mismanagement or bleeding of money. They can help to identify future opportunities to stabilize and grow SABC. It will only enrich that board. It's pointless to have a board.
I noticed with the nominations that you mentioned, you've mentioned somebody from Sakao. Would you then not put forward somebody from any of your alliance partners, the SACP or the ANC, to be part of the board? Would they not then fulfill the mandate that you've jointly agreed on?
No, for us, the critical issue in Cosatu since our founding in 1985 has been about worker leadership. So even in Cosatu's leadership, you always have workers who are employed full-time in factories representing workers. We don't want politicians to represent workers. We don't want people chosen by Luthuli House to represent workers. It must be people from the workforce to represent workers.
But are these not your alliance partners? Do you then not agree or converge on issues that have to do with the interests of workers? Is that what you're saying?
We do agree, and we are alliance partners, but we're independent. Cosatu, first and foremost, is a trade union federation consisting of 17 independent trade unions organizing in different sectors. And our mandate, above all, comes from those members and from workers.
So you wouldn't want anybody from the ANC or SACP on the board of the SABC?
We would welcome them to be on the board, but not to represent workers. Workers must be represented by workers, full stop. And for us, that's the issue of non-compromise. We've seen how in the past, the issue of friendship and comradeship has been abused. Workers now want to be represented by workers. And the Act is very clear on that. It's not an issue of Parliament deciding if it's in the mood to entertain the Act. They have to abide by the letter and by the spirit of the Act at all times.
All right, thank you very much. Cosatu's Parliamentary Liaison Officer in Parliament, Mathew Parks.